Anyway, all right. Well, good evening, everybody. And for those of you who are tuning in online, I'm sorry. I know you cannot see me right now, but we'll be adjusting the camera momentarily. But just want to welcome everybody to the New York, or the People's Marxist School of New York. We're having today our final session of our series on African American history. Knowledge of African American history is a weapon against the far right. And for this class, this is going to be our finale session. We've broken up American history into 4 parts. And this session, we're going to be dealing with the time from the Brown versus Board of Education up until the present. The 2 presenters that we have basically are going to be speaking today about their life's work. Jarvis Tyner is the executive vice chair of the Communist Party. He grew up in northern Philadelphia.
Huh? You gotta get that right.
Oh, West Philly? See, I'm thinking about the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I'm thinking about Will Smith. Wait, I thought you said North Philadelphia is born and raised. Okay, fine.
No, he says West Philadelphia.
Oh, well, all right, my bad. See, the show's up here. I need cable, man. I get it right if I got cable. Anyway, he's from Washington Heights right now, but West Philadelphia back in the days. But in that city where he, I know one pivotal part of his life was actually being a part of the integration of American Bandstand, and that was a young man who was looking for a good time. That kind of quest took him to the struggle for equality, and that was, because we face inequality in so many different ways. But just this dude's a great dancer, but his quest to be able to be on that show and dance in an integrated setting, was the first blow of many against this capitalist system of racism and so on. Danny Rubin, also from Philadelphia. I don't want to get this wrong, so I'm gonna just leave out any geographical coordinates or northwest or anything like that. He is from the city of Philadelphia, and he too knows firsthand the fight against inequality and the repression of racism. He is a Jewish man. He grew up in a neighborhood that wasn't majority Jewish. He knew what it's like to be persecuted, and he was alive during the time of when Nazi Germany was leading a war against genocide against the Jewish people in Europe. And other, not just Jewish people, but other working people, and that helped him also to kind of see, as he witnessed in Philadelphia and throughout this country, how racism is so central to this system of capitalism. That's been a major part of his work as a leader of this Communist Party and fighting racism. I know myself as a young black man, I've learned a lot from Danny, and I felt the warmth of his love for our people and our quest towards freedom. So basically, I just wanted to get up here and introduce these 2 gentlemen who's going to be leading our talk about this historic struggle of the people of this country, of this world, against racism and for equality, and its connection to the building of socialism in this land and in this world. And I think that that's good enough for y'all to take it away from here. So let us adjust this camera and get going. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Danny, who seems to be living forever, which is wonderful. It got to do with the struggle first and foremost. But when I was just 20 years old and I found the movement, I had a lot of good social skills. Believe me, I could go to a party and get it going. But I didn't have any political skills at all. But I had a deep feeling that racism and inequality that our people were confronting was not acceptable. And when I saw what was exploding out of the South in terms of people's struggle, had a big impact on me and all of my friends in high school, and I found my way to the movement thanks to living in a neighborhood where there was a Communist Party club. They got involved in the civil rights movement, and the rest is history. But before I go further, let me just say a couple things. One, I want to extend a special welcome to Ernest and Linda Walker, who are leaders of the Communist Party of Ireland, and who are here to visit. And I think we're going to have a little session with them at some point here. But please welcome them. And I hope we'll hear from them at some point in our discussion. I'm only going to do a little short thing in the beginning, and I'm going to come back in and discuss another era, but I want to set it up for Danny, who's done a very extensive study of the whole broad sweep of the civil rights movement during the 60s, with a particular emphasis on the role of the party. And people don't know the role the party played in the whole fight for the end of racism and inequality. Because of the McCarthyism and all the repression that we faced, Dr. King was under tremendous pressure to denounce the communists who were working around him and so forth. He had to fire them. Then he hired them back. Then he fired them. Then he hired them back, as J. Edgar Hoover was really on his back. And ultimately, he made one of the greatest speeches of a mass leader against anti-communism in 1967. Was it 67? Yeah. At the centennial for Dr. W.B. Du Bois. And his transition, his evolution in thinking and in political just maturity, and just his worldview was so wonderful. In better times and with a larger party, I'm sure he would have been very close to us. So Danny can tell us how we play our role under these difficult circumstances. But there's been 4 sessions. We started out in 1526 when the first Africans were brought here by a Spanish explorer, and they settled at a little settlement in South Carolina at the beginning, the mouth of the PD River, and I think they lasted for just a few months, and the slaves figured out, hey, we don't have to stay here. And they got up and ran away. And the Spanish explorer said, well, I don't know why we're here. We leave. They got up and got in their boat and they left. But so I think the Native American Indians embraced them. And because there was an attempt to enslave Native American Indians, and they wouldn't have any of that, because this was their land, and they understood it better and knew it better than anyone else. That was the beginning, and we went all the way through basically 300 years of history, not thoroughly, but with enough to give an overview, and then we all the way up to the slave trade period, all the way up to the Civil War, which was the bloodiest war in our history. More Americans died in the Civil War than any war since. And that war was over the issue of slavery, even though slavery said, oh, it's secession of the states. That's what they always say. I had a big argument with a lawyer in my family once. Not anybody you know, and she was arguing that, oh no, it's because of secession of the states. I said, why does the states want to secede? Slavery. And that was the reason. And so therefore the question of the liberation of people of African descent, which is linked to the liberation of all people and the working class, has been a long and difficult struggle. Nelson Mandela says the road to freedom is no easy walk, and it has not. And the people who have perished, millions in just the slave trade and so forth, people have perished from just being worked to death as field hands, and all the humiliation and physical abuse. I guess slavery could be seen as a fascist kind of existence. People had no rights. And the key thing to remember is how slavery was forged on to capitalism. I don't want to go on, but we went through all of that. And I hope that what we laid out here will help people study more. We use the works of William Z. Foster, who wrote this wonderful book on the history of the Negro people. And tonight, though, we want to bring it up to date. And we want to focus on, at least for me, I'm going to focus on this book, Bold, Bad 60s, by James Jackson, who was a great leader of our party and who passed, about 5 years ago? Yeah. And he was a national leader. He was international secretary of the party. He was education director of the party for many, many years, African-American. He came out of Virginia. He was involved in a tobacco workers organizing in Virginia, but he also went to Howard University, the same town. Ralph Bunche was there, and they were all in this radical stuff going on. Everybody knows who Ralph Bunche is, right? No. Okay. He was the first African-American, I think, to gain a high position in the American Diplomatic Corps, and he helped to negotiate the settlement of the Suez Canal crisis. He's African-American now. They all went to Howard. And so Jim actually is a trained pharmacist. That's why he has a doctor in front of his name. But he really made a magnificent contribution to our party. Now, so I'm not going to be too long. But what I wanted to do was just to set up things so Danny can take us down the road that he has prepared his remarks about. First of all, the Second World War had a big impact on accelerating the fight for civil rights. My father came back from the Second World War, and we were so happy to see him. When we left, we were all crying in the living room. Then he came back. Yes, I'm that old that I remember the Second World War. And he came back, and he said that he was in Europe. And he said, you know, the white folks, he comes from rural North Carolina. He said, the white folks in Europe, they seem a lot nicer than the ones we have here. And so he started telling about driving trucks, and they would go to dances and places, and they would be all integrated, and they would get to know people treated them decent. And I know a relative of mine literally ran into the Communist Party in Europe in the post-war period at the end of the war. And he was always very supportive of what I do and what the party represents. But when those soldiers came back, many of them went back to their homes in the Deep South, and they were not allowed to go in certain restaurants. Even the military, the veteran cemeteries were segregated, and they had Nazis, war criminals in the South, that they put them in prison camps in the South, that could go in town and have a drink and come back and over, but the black soldiers who had fought and died for freedom against these Nazis did not have the same right. There was a moral crisis, deep moral crisis created, but more than that, a sense of we're not going to take this, we're not going to take this. And that atmosphere ultimately led to the integration of the military, because, you know, my father went to the Second World War, it was segregated. You didn't have any black soldiers in their unit at all. The whites over here, the blacks over there, and they were not treated equal. So all these young African-American men who came from all over the region, actually, they didn't just come out of here, went to fight this war and came back and wanted freedom. And they were not going to be denied. There were cases of soldiers getting lynched in their uniform when they got back to the field. People heard that. So the 1954 Supreme Court decision that called for the integration of public schools was very important, because it overthrew the old Plessy versus Ferguson, Plessy versus Ferguson law, which said that we are for separate but equal equality for all. So the races should be separated, but they should be equal. Of course, that is a contradiction in terms. By virtue of segregation, there were dual standards of access to society, access to jobs, access to education. So for the southern schools, my mother taught in the Southern Murmur Schoolhouse in rural North Carolina, where she was from as well. And They never had enough money, and it was so frustrating for her that she quit teaching school and told her father he said, "You go back and teach the school." She says, "No, I'm not. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to become a beautician." She took a higher calling, you might say. But at the time, coming from where she was coming from, it was a real step forward. And she went to beauty school and became a beautician. But they always told us to fight for our rights. They always told us to fight for our rights. When the '54 Supreme Court decision came, that was the highest court in the land saying separate but equal is wrong. And we don't have to take that. And of course, the great Thurgood Marshall was the attorney on that case, Brown versus Board of Education, and he later went on to become the first African American member of the U.S. Supreme Court. But he also was a very courageous lawyer and organized that case before the Supreme Court brilliantly. All right, maybe taking too much time, but I wanted to paint this picture. And so. In 1955, young Emmett Till goes down to Mississippi on a family vacation, and he goes into a store. He's from Chicago. He goes into a convenience store, and there is a young white girl there, and he whistled at her. She went up and said, "Daddy, that so-and-so whistled at me." That night, they went and grabbed him out of his uncle's house, and they did unspeakable, bestial things to this 14-year-old kid. By the way, he was born the same month and year that I was born. So he was cut out a whole lot of life at 14 that he would never experience. And the murder of him was so horrible, party got involved, but I won't go into all that. The end result was that when his family found out and his mother said that she wanted an open casket at the funeral. And I think the Civil Rights Congress was involved in that in that effort. And all around the country, people on the cover of Jet magazine, which was the largest circulation black, they saw what these people had done to this 14-year-old kid. And I'm telling you, in some of the northern cities, people were literally thinking of organizing and going down there with guns. I mean, that's how much that impacted them, because this great awakening from the war, this great sense that we can achieve the end of Jim Crow, had been smacked in the face with this brutality, this viciousness, this bestiality of racism and Jim Crow in the South. And people, civil rights mobilized as a political question, and so on. It stopped any further bloodshed in that regard. But that had a big impact. There were various youth marches and so forth, prayer vigils and so on behalf of civil rights. The party had been involved in the 1930s very heavily, and much of the vestige of what they had established was down there. I often wonder when the people in the 60s saw these young people coming back to the South. Some of them remembered in the 1930s that there were some young communists and young trade union leaders and so forth who came to the South to organize on an integrated basis. And you know, right away, the racists said that they're all a bunch of communists, and therefore what we're doing is fighting communism. Sounds like South Africa, right? Yeah, same kind of stuff. That's what they said. And the noble cause of freedom, which the communists gave their lives, many of them, for, the noble cause of fighting racism was pushed aside, and therefore this was a conspiracy for Moscow. That's what they said we were dealing with. Well, that had a certain impact, but not for a lot of people, and they broke. And if you remember, 1955, the same year of Emmett Till, Rosa Parks said, "I'm not getting up my seat from the bus in Montgomery, Alabama." And that act, there have been many people who have done it before, but there was something very special about Rosa Parks in that she was really kind of an quote upstanding member of society. She was a seamstress in a department store. For a job for an African American was considered a kind of good job and something a stable person would have. She was also a secretary of the NAACP. And when she decided to do it, and the driver said, "Get out of here," so forth, called the police, and she got arrested, and she proudly walked to the police car into jail. It had a huge impact, and there was a leaflet issue in Montgomery. Black woman arrested, a Negro woman arrested for sitting in the white section of the bus, and that really mobilized the people again in this period of great sense of change, a great upsurge in the sense of that we've got to do something about this race. We've lived on it long enough. Well, as you know, for over a year, they boycotted the buses in Montgomery, and you also know, you may not know, but Martin Luther King, who was the youngest minister in town, none of the established ministers were brave enough to take on the issue of the bus boycott, or this issue of segregated buses and public accommodations. But they were looking around for somebody who could lead it. And one of them said, "What is that new minister over there, young guy? He may be 20s or something." And he said, "Maybe he'll do it." And sure enough, they went to see this Martin Luther King, and he agreed. I was reading Taylor Branch's book, Parting the Waters, where he talks about how King didn't know quite what he was getting into. But he did have the courage to step up and lead that great boycott. End result, of course, is they won. And Dr. King emerged on the national scene as really a wonderful leader of this movement. It's a great revolutionary democratic movement, really, because it really did change the nature of rule in the Deep South and affected the whole country's attitude towards equality and democracy and so forth. They have to be included. Black folks have to be included. And when the Latinos started to move, and Dr. King immediately embraced it. The Native American, he immediately embraced it. Our movement took on this quality of unity, multiracial unity. Then it was Little Rock in 1957, which is the integrating of the high school there, and the mobs of whites who were mobilized by the governor of Arkansas, Orvis Faubus. Y'all remember that great Greek name? But no believer in democracy. And he called on the local police to defend the schools and don't let these black kids get in. The federal government had to intervene. In the meantime, people would spit on, even children would spit on and threaten, and the people got violent in those communities and showed that they didn't want it. And I remember my best friend in high school saying to me, "What is wrong with these people? Why do they hate us so much? What do we do? We went to an integrated high school in Philadelphia. We had our problems, but not like that." And I guess one of the things that inspired me by that statement was, let's find out why they do it. Let's try to stop it. And that's when I got into the civil rights movement as soon as I graduated. After that, in 1957, I think it was, the SCLC formed itself, the Southern Christian Leadership Council formed itself, and that became the leading body, pretty much, of the civil rights movement, along with SNCC and CORE, SNCC Southern Negro Youth. Oh, Student Nonviolent. Thank you. I started the wrong way. Student Nonviolent Committee, which I worked with for a long time, but I forgot. And as well, the CORE organization, Congress of Racial Equality, and a whole number of other organizations, the NAACP and so forth, were involved. So now the floodgates have opened. People in struggle. People are not afraid. They've already seen the violence in Little Rock, in Charlotte, and Mississippi, and Alabama. In May, I think it was 57, 58, they had the Freedom Rides going down in the bus. And among the people who went down were mainly young people, but black, white, and so forth. And they were met with great vicious attacks. They burned buses, they pulled people off of buses, beat them, they jailed them. and so forth and so on. Danny's going to give us a little more detail on that kind of thing. So, as I said, the cat was out of the bag in a sense. People were in motion, and they were not going to be stopped by this thing. And they were so powerful and inspirational that it had a dramatic effect on the whole country. In 1960s, the students at North Carolina A&T College, 4 of them, went down to Woolworth's lunch, 5 and dime, and sat at the lunch counter, which was segregated, and would not move. And for months, more and more young people came down from that college and did it. And AT&T was not known as a political activist college. It wasn't at all. But this was the mood of the generation of young people. And racists came there every night, poured coffee, poured sugar on their head, pushed them and everything, but they practiced nonviolence. And it spread throughout the South, sit-ins at lunch counters. And that had a great inspiration to young people all over the country who supported that effort. And one of the first things I did when I came in the movement was to boycott picket the Woolworths on Lancaster Avenue in West Philadelphia, just to cut into their business. That was all over the country that was happening. Now, Betty Hutton owned Woolworths. She was the single owner, maybe, and she supposedly had some pangs of guilt about it, but never did anything about it. But those young people who struggled and the pressure around the world forced the desegregation of the lunch counter. So I will now turn the floor over to Danny, who will talk about that whole era and the role particularly of our party. Thank you.
Well, that's a wonderful introduction to what I want to deal with. This is based on the fact that on that very same day, February 1st, 1960, that these 4 students from North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat in at Woolworths. That was the first day that I moved from Philadelphia to New York at the request of the party, my wife and I. And I assumed the role of National Youth Secretary of the party. Before I tell you my first experience, about 10 days later, when I went to North Carolina, to Greensboro, North Carolina, and met with those 4 students, I want to say a few more things that are kind of introductory. I mentioned last time that the historians today, most of them paint the picture that the party played a big role in the struggle against racism for full equality in the 20s and 30s. But come the period of McCarthyism in the late 40s, the party was no longer a factor in the struggle against racism and for full equality. There's now a new school of historians. A couple of them have interviewed me because I was involved in the work of the party nationally in this period, who contend that that's not true, that the party was smaller, and it had to work in different ways that Jarvis was referring to, not bragging about or showing the red flag everywhere, but we were a significant factor in the whole, what we now call the Civil Rights Revolution, in which Jarvis just also called it a revolution. And I know the leadership of the party, shortly after the spontaneous movement, which spread rapidly all over the South, of students sitting in at Woolworths and other places where they would not serve African American people. This movement that was sweeping the South on that score and on the score of fighting for the right to register to vote, and every other sign of Jim Crow in the South was being attacked. It was spreading rapidly. So the party leadership concluded that this was a new 3rd stage in the democratic revolution of the United States. The first stage being the American Revolution, the second stage being the Civil War, and this Civil Rights Revolution being the third stage, which was expanding democracy in the first place for the especially oppressed African American people of the South and of the whole country, but for all Americans, that it was in the interest of all the people of the United States, all working people, at least. So we considered it very, very important, and we undertook to do things. Before I talk about some of the things that we did, you need to know a couple more things, I think, about the period beforehand and what we were doing. Jarvis mentioned Jim Jackson and held up his book and mentioned the Southern Negro Youth Congress. The Southern Negro Youth Congress was formed in 1936-37 and lasted until about 1947. It was founded by six African-American, three couples, six people, who were members of the Young Communist League, and with the support of the Communist Party, set up headquarters in Birmingham and began years of activity that involved, the estimate is, 100,000 African-American youth and some white youth. In all these kind of activities that were aimed at registering to vote, fighting for the vote, fighting to organize unions. Jarvis mentioned Jim Jackson and the organization of the 5,000 tobacco workers in the Richmond area. And in the course of this, he met many of the people who then became leaders of the movement in the late 50s and into the 60s, into the Civil Rights Revolution. So that when that period came, Jim Jackson, who then was the Southern Party Secretary of the party, he headed the party's work in the South. And he traveled all over every day at risk of his life. And he knew some of the figures like C.T. Vivian. These were all ministers in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference organization that Martin Luther King came to head. Lowry, Wyatt T. Walker, Shuttlesworth of Birmingham fame, and so on. And he knew Rosa Parks from those days. She was part of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. So was Sally Davis, the mother of Angela Davis, a very active person in that movement. I'm tempted to tell some side stories, but time won't allow me. So come the Civil Rights Revolution proper, we were able to travel through the South and talk with people and find out what their needs were, how to help. And I will tell you some concrete stories of that in a moment. And another aspect of that revolution, as Jarvis again pointed out, was the peaceful protest, civil disobedience. Where did they learn that? Well, they learned it from Gandhi, that's true. But they also learned it at the Highlander Folk School in Chattanooga, Tennessee. What was the Highlander School? Folk School in Chattanooga. It was a center for opposition in the South to racism and for equality, and was begun in 1933 by Miles Horton, a left-wing socialist, and Don West, a Methodist minister who died a few years ago at the age of 95, still head of this school, who was a member of the Communist Party all that time, from 1933 to when he died. Who went to the Highlander School? Many of the leaders of the civil rights movement learned their tactics of peaceful resistance at the Highlander School. Coretta Scott King spent time there. John Lewis spent a lot of time there, and many others. So these were forms in which the party made a contribution. It set up a network of different kinds of organization, both in the South and throughout the country. Not alone, always with others, but very effective. The history of the organization of African American workers that begins in 1925 with the American Negro Labor Council, reestablished that. After the Second World War, the National Negro Labor Council was established with Coleman Young as the head of it, the national head of it. Who was Coleman Young? Well, we know him as the 6th-term mayor of Detroit, Michigan. But Coleman Young was a worker in Ford River Rouge and an active leader of the workers there, and a member of the Communist Party. He was a member of the Communist Party until he dropped out, being sworn in as mayor of Detroit. I met him in Detroit for the first time in 1960. These are things that are not known, and I think it's about time that we don't have to worry so much about the anti-communist smears. And that was part of what we did. We also established an organization that was aimed at white anti-racist people in the South. And that was the Southern Conference Educational Fund, headed by Ann and Carl Braden. They were members of the party. In 1946, I think it was, their home in Louisville, Kentucky was bombed. And lo and behold, they arrested Carl Braden for bombing his own house and charged him with sedition. And he spent years in jail. Ann Braden dropped out of the party at some point, and at their 21st Congress convention of the party, from the platform she rejoined the party. So then we come to the events that Jarvis mentioned in the period between the Brown versus Board of Education decision and the start of the sit-ins. And he mentioned that there was a prayer pilgrimage and there were 2 youth marches for integrated schools. The second one that went to Washington, D.C., had 30,000 young people, mainly African American, but quite a few white youth as well. We played a big role in the whole thing. Ben Davis, one of our most prominent and magnificent African American leaders of our party, of which we had many, he was, I don't know whether everybody here knows who he was, but he was from Georgia. He defended Angelo Herndon in the early 30s, who was a YCL organizer, African American, and was framed up and was facing 30 years in prison, and he won. He came to New York, and he became a member of the city council on the Communist Party basis. He was, acknowledged as a leader of the Communist Party, and he, along with Pete Caccioni, won city council seats. Well, Ben Davis was also a friend of Bayard Rustin. I don't know whether you all, remember the name Bayard Rustin. He appeared in a number of different periods. And one of them was he was the main organizer of the prayer pilgrimage and the 2 youth marches. And he did that after meeting with Ben Davis and being convinced that you needed a mass movement to enforce the Brown versus Board of Education. And I don't have time, I won't take the time now, about what we did in Philadelphia. Because of the 30,000 young people who went there, we brought 2,000 of them from Philadelphia. And that can be demonstrated. So these are then, Jarvis also mentioned Little Rock, Arkansas. And that reminds me of the fact that I picked up the New York Times a couple months ago and I read the name Lee Lorch, an obituary for Lee Lorch. Who was Lee Lorch? He was a mathematics teacher, a member of the Communist Party, as was his wife, Clara Lorch. And they lived in Stuyvesant Town, which was a Jim Crow, all-white city within the city. And they led the fight for years, including bringing African Americans in to stay for months and months in their apartment. And then when they were finally forced out, they went to different places. He had a very hard time finding a job. They landed in Little Rock, Arkansas, with him as a professor at an all-black college there. And he became active in the NAACP, worked with Daisy Bates, worked with the first effort of children, of African American children, to enter a all-white school that was met, as Jarvis pointed out, by vicious attacks on the children, and spitting and throwing things and cursing them by a rather large white mob. And emerging, I didn't know this until I reread Jim Jackson's book. He was there at that time. I had forgotten that. And he knew Daisy Bates from the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And he considered her a comrade. And who stepped forward in that rabble of people to put her arms around the African American children and help take them into the school? Clara Lorch. So anyway, those are some of the background hidden things prior to February 1st, 1960. I had just become National Youth Secretary, and I had never worked for the party before. I had held leading positions in the Eastern Pennsylvania District. And I was a fresh guy on the scene, and I was called in by Jim Jackson and by the National Organizational Secretary, and they proposed to me that I go to Greensboro, North Carolina, and see if I can meet with the young people who initiated this thing that was then sweeping the South and in a sense, sweeping the country. And I agreed to do that, and about 10 days later, I drove my Pennsylvania license plate car from New York City alone through the South. I visited some comrades in Virginia and so on, to Greensboro. I went as a correspondent for Mainstream magazine to interview these students about what they had done, why they had done it, what their experience was. And I went straight to the campus. And I had no difficulty in meeting with them. They were very, very friendly people. And for a white guy who they didn't know coming from the north, amazingly open. And I did interview them and got quite a story. And then I asked them whether they were in touch with any of the other people in other cities that were engaging in the same tactics, sit-ins at Woolworths and so on and so forth. And they said no. I said I knew somebody in Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore and Maryland were Jim Crow cities, city and state. That I knew the head of the NAACP Youth Council in Baltimore, Maryland, and they had just sat in at Woolworth's following the example. And they said they'd be interested in getting in touch. And I said, I'm traveling across North Carolina from Greensboro east to Raleigh, and there are people engaging in sit-ins all across. Would you be interested if I could talk with them and being put in touch with them, and being put in touch with the head of the NAACP Youth Council in Baltimore, Maryland? Yes, they would be. Of course, the head of the NAACP Youth Council in Baltimore, Maryland was a member of the Labor Youth League and a member of the Communist Party. His name was Tony, and I have forgotten his last name. His father was Italian, and his mother was African American, and it began with an A. So I've looked, tried to find his last name. So I've made up Antoniello. And I knew him from the 50s, from the middle 50s, when he was a member of the three-person youth work committee of the NAACP youth work. They had 38,000 young people in youth councils around the country, and they had a three-person committee that headed that work. Tony Antoniello was one of them. There was another African American whose name I never knew, and there was Lou Sharp. Lou Sharp I knew. He was the only white person on it, because he was a member of the party. So almost by accident, two of the three members who led the NAACP youth work were members of the Communist Party. And that went on for a long time. So I put the Greensboro, North Carolina people in touch with all these, and then I went back across North Carolina toward Winston-Salem. I was going to visit an old party comrade who was there, and I started down the hill into Winston-Salem in my car alone, and I suddenly noticed that I was being followed by two cars. And I didn't know whether they were FBI, state police, KKK, or a combination of them. So I decided I would not go visit that comrade and bring whoever was following me to know who I was visiting, and that I would leave North Carolina. And so I drove on a highway from there up to Charlottesville, toward Charlottesville, Virginia, where the University of Virginia was located, and where I knew two people who were left-wing but not party people, including a person who had been my best friend for many years and whose family brought me into the movement. So I'm driving along this highway from Winston-Salem to Charlottesville, Virginia, and it's deserted. No cars going the same way, no cars coming. Just me and these two cars following me. So I was tempted to race it. See what happened if I got across the state line, whether they would continue to follow me or not. But I went at a good pace, but I didn't race. I didn't want to get arrested for speeding. Stopped and arrested for speeding. And at the border between North Carolina and Virginia, they dropped off. They didn't continue to follow me. I went back to New York, and I thought, well, nothing would come of my effort to try to get a Southwide conference of sit-inners, of the people, in sit-ins. And nothing did happen that I knew of. Nobody got in touch with me. And suddenly I read in the New York Times in April that Stokely Carmichael and Tony Antoniello have called a Southwide conference of sit-inners for Raleigh, North Carolina's Shaw University, an all-black university. And then I read a couple weeks later, the conference has taken place, and the the co-chairs of the conference are Stokely Carmichael and Tony Antoniello. I then lost track of Tony for some time, and a year or two later, I learned that a few months later, after that conference, he was killed in a mysterious auto accident in Baltimore, Maryland. And people figured that the racists had killed him. That's what we were dealing with. Not long after that, a young comrade, a YCL kind of person, whose father was a leader of the fur and leather workers, called me on the phone. I had met her once only, and said, I have somebody who wants to meet you, and I'd like to see you in person and talk to you about it. And we did. She said, John Lewis. How many of you know who John Lewis is? There are a few people who don't know who John Lewis is. John Lewis is a member of the House and has been part of the leadership, four-person leadership in the House for many years, who was considered called the conscience of the Congress. He became the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that was founded at that conference that I mentioned soon after. And she was arranging a meeting between John Lewis and myself. How did she know John Lewis? She knew John Lewis from Highlander Folk School, where she spent time and he spent time learning the art of civil disobedience. The meeting took place in her apartment on West 14th Street, and John Lewis, then he was a young minister who would, according to Jim Jackson's book, he had interviewed him. He was 23 years old, and he had been arrested 23 times and put in prison and beaten several times. Later on, at the bridge in Selma, Alabama, in the first march, he was the leader of the march, and he was beaten down by the police and almost killed. He still has a steel plate in his head from it. At that time, he was very modest, very soft-spoken, and I began by asking him, Communist Party, as you know, stands for and always has stood for full equality and against racism. And we want to do whatever we can to help the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the whole movement in the South, but we want to do it quietly. We don't want to make it easy for the red baiters to red bait it and divide it and so on. What can we do to help? And he thought for a couple moments, and he said, well, we're setting up our national office in Atlanta, and we need an office manager, a person who can run the office, and while we're out in the field organizing protests of various kinds and getting people to register to vote in those struggles, so on. And I thought for a moment, and I said, oh, I think I have the person. And I thought of Debbie Amos. Debbie Amos in Philadelphia, who Jarvis and I have both known for many, many years. And I knew her father. Her father was B.D. Amos, who in the early 30s was an organizer for the Communist Party. They're African American, Debbie and B.D. He was organizing unions in the South, and he was arrested and faced a Sedition Act indictment, and he would have been put in prison in 35 for 35 years, probably, if we had won that case also. So she knew what it was all about. And every time I used to go into their home, their mother was white and was my party section organizer in Philadelphia. There was B.D. Amos, and he would greet me. He was then an oil worker in Philadelphia. So Debbie Amos was asked whether she wanted to do that, and she said yes, that she definitely wanted to do it, and she did it. And now there is this book of 50 women who were part of the activists of SNCC, who did all kinds of heroic things. And there's a chapter on her in which she tells her experience both in the office and going into the field. We sent a number of people to join SNCC as a result of that meeting with John Lewis. And at the end of the meeting, I said, well, I can suggest, these things that I've been talking about, but there's somebody who could suggest a lot more than me because he has a much better picture of the party's work nationally than I do. And that was Ben Davis. And I mentioned Ben Davis's name, and I said, would you like to meet with Ben Davis? Do you know who Ben Davis is? And he did know the name Ben Davis because of the Angelo Herndon case in particular. And then when he was reminded that Ben Davis had been elected a member of the City Council of New York City. Wow, I better cut this short. And when Ben Davis joined us at the second meeting, we raised the question of financial help, not from the party, but that we had a lot of influence with 1199. The founders of 1199 were all members of the Communist Party assigned to do it. Leon Davis and all the others. And with the packing house workers. And we thought we could influence them to get their unions through their democratic processes to vote large sums of money to help SNCC, and they did. That happened. One other thing, and then I'll stop. Again, Jarvis mentioned Martin Luther King and the role he played, and we all feel that he played, of course, a very historic role, and his development and so on. And this lawyer, Stanley Levison, who I knew as a Communist Party lawyer in Washington, D.C., very influential, with a lot of ties on a lot of things, and a big fundraiser for us, who then went and joined, he dropped out of the party, left the party, went to join the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and became their lawyer, their official lawyer, and also a big fundraiser for them. And then when they started red baiting and discovered him, he said, I ought to leave. This is not good for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, not good for you, Martin. There was a TV program that portrayed these events. And so you see the conversation, and Martin Luther King says, they're going to red bait us no matter what we do. Don't go, we need you, you're doing good work, you're making a big contribution. And he said, I really feel I must go. And there was another, in this television program, there was another man there, a third man, who was an African American who was also a lawyer. It was Martin Luther King's personal lawyer. And I didn't catch the name. But he agreed with Martin that it would be good if he stayed. But he did leave and then later came back and so on, as Jarvis said. a couple years ago, I'm listening to WNYC, and they have on a program about evidence that the FBI was involved in the assassination of Martin Luther King, and they had to know. And a new book had been written about it, and it had been written by Martin Luther King's personal lawyer. And then I hear this voice. I'm not paying too much attention. I'm doing something else, and I hear this voice, and I said, I know that voice. And it turned out it was Clarence Jones, who was the personal lawyer of Martin Luther King, who wrote the first draft of I Have a Dream speech for Martin with his guidance. And I knew him as a member of the Communist Party in the 1950s. We worked on building a national conference of students to form a left-wing national organization of students. And I had several meetings with him. He and I were the main organizers of it. It was held in Madison, Wisconsin. The main speaker was Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, and I had the honor of escorting Dr. Du Bois from the plane all through the day, through a luncheon with student leaders, and back to the plane, and so on. So Clarence Jones, this person I had lost track of for many years, turned out to be one of the closest associates of Martin Luther King, and had been a member of the Communist Party for a whole number of years. I don't know when he dropped out, but he did. I'm going to stop there, but that's just tidbits. There's more that there's not time for, that I'll tell some other time.
Well, thank you, Danny, for that. The fight against racism is really a noble cause. It brings out the greatest, how should I say, the most beautiful side of human beings, to get involved in this struggle. And in our country, so many people went down that road that you don't hear. But today I was looking at a picture I have from the Du Bois Club days, and there's Jim Peak. Remember Jim Peak? Jim Peak was a white Southern guy who was confined to a wheelchair, had a spinal problem, who was one of the most militant people you ever want to meet in terms of sit-ins. He would get in his wheelchair and get right in the middle of the arrest. The cops would grab him. He'd be fighting back. What happened to those people? I mean, they were so wonderful. Jim, he passed, I know. But I'm just saying, and what a great man. And Danny has told us a story, really, which paints a beautiful picture of a life with a purpose. What a beautiful thing. And I'm hoping that he won't keep this a secret and put it out in some form of memoirs or something, so that, because I absolutely think people will want to know what the party did, what Danny did, and so on. Our time is very difficult right now, and I'm not sure where to go, but we want to, don't we want to end it by 8:30?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So there's a lot of other subjects that are on our outline that Danny and I worked out together here, but I'm going to be very brief about, first, this all led to the big march on Washington in 1963. Everybody knows that. And the big march was a big turning point. It was after they killed Medgar Evers, who was NAACP Secretary of Mississippi. Mississippi. They shot him down in his driveway. And there were other acts of extreme violence that was going on. They just felt, the Southern racists felt they were losing hold of the situation. And the ruling class was having questions about whether or not Jim Crow was the way to rule the South, especially as industry went to the South and jobs, and people were moving from rural to urban, and the working class was growing. There was some union activity, but mostly the civil rights movement had swept up so many people and motivated them into political struggle. And anybody with any sense could see that this thing was going to die. Jim Crow was going to die. And so the Southern races went on a rampage all over the South. And so many were killed, harassed, beaten, lynched, all kinds of things. So this march, when they called it, people were opposed to it. I'm talking about the establishment. The Kennedy administration didn't agree with it. They thought it was going to be violence. There was a general view that the Southerners and the right wing pushed heavy that you bring that many black people to Washington and you're going to have a riot. And, so they, for example, they closed the liquor stores, because, once you get around liquor and black people, it's over. And they put the army on alert, ready to come out and take over this thing because there's going to be a riot. The television networks put the cameras 30 feet in the air. I was there, actually, 30 feet in the air to film this thing because they thought they were going to film a big riot. Some right-wingers were in another area agitating and so forth, not many of them, but it was the greatest outpouring of the spirit of democracy and freedom that I've ever seen to the American people. 250,000 people came out, and it was multiracial, predominantly black, but multiracial. And the labor movements played a big role protecting that march because Ben Davis played a role in that too. We'll go on to that. But he helped to mobilize the unions because all this talk about violence, he helped to mobilize the unions, and they said, we will secure this march, and they did. And the end result was that Ben Davis, therefore, that's one of his last great acts, what he did for that march. But in end result,
he worked with Bayard Rustin again.
Bayard Rustin and him were friends. So in end result was we had this great march, which was a turning point. People, I have the button of that march hanging on my desk right there. People wore that button for years after the march. It really transformed so many people because it showed a majoritarian movement now in this country was opposed to racism, discrimination, and Jim Crow, and wanted to move towards it. And of course, I have a dream to do that. Okay. We're supposed to get to the day a little bit. But I'm kind of thinking y'all been sitting here taking in, and maybe you have questions or comments you might want to make. And then I have a final thing I want to make on today's struggle. So I open the floor to anybody who wants to stand up and preach or whatever. That button is over 50 years old, so handle it with
Any questions or comments?
Okay. Well, you all know that the African American people have really suffered in this last economic crisis. The unemployment rate is the highest among all people. They're saying 13.5%, but it was up in the height of the crisis. It was up past 20%. And among young people, particularly African American young people, 45% unemployment rate. And then you deal with the destruction of the schools, the whole attack of the right wing on public services. Here's a time when people are the poorest and the most in need, and they cut Section 8 for housing. They've cut food stamps. They've cut welfare is gone pretty much. It used to be a huge savior for a lot of people. They pretty much cut it down to the very, very bare minimum and frankly reduced amounts and so forth. At this desperate time they have done this. You know that in New York, I saw a figure the other day, that the number of evictions of working people in New York last year alone was 30,000. And you know what they're doing to our communities? They are...
Gentrification.
Gentrification. Absolutely. It's designed to put our people in an untenable position. But we've been in an untenable position before. And this is very important to understand. Maya Angelou says we rise, and I'm going to read that a little bit of that poem before we end. She talks about how through all the years of hurt, pain, and attacks, and repression, and poverty, and so forth, we continue to rise. She raised the question, despite all that, we rise. We fought on. And our slogan about we're not going back kind of codifies that idea that the struggle continues and it will not be abated. No one would live like this and stay quiet and whatever. And sometimes our youth pick the wrong way to do it. You don't give them jobs. The only option for jobs in the communities is either drug trade or gang life. So they don't have families that collapse under the sick, and then they go after them for that, put them all in prison and on the drugs and so forth. We still rise. We still got to fight our way out of this thing. We've got to do something about this economic crisis that has been imposed on our people. And the party feels that actually it is time to really try to break and defeat the right-wing forces who are the ramrod of all of these reactionary policies. You know the Supreme Court's recent decision on affirmative action. It is in effect a way of nullifying affirmative action state by state by state. It's still part of federal law. It's still constitutional. The Supreme Court said on a federal basis, but then they rule, but it's okay if you don't want it in your state. So the state of Michigan, under the section 26 of their state law, state constitution, said that if you don't want affirmative action in your state, in this state, we can rule against it. Overrule the elected regents in the colleges who want to have affirmative action, and in effect, it's literally cutting off any upward mobility, cutting it off. No upward mobility for people. So they're just saying, who live in squalor and unemployment and so forth, will help to build a little bit of a middle class that can walk around on television, look like everything is wonderful. It will cut off the funds for education, which they have done, make it inexpensive. And it doesn't just affect African Americans. We know it is very serious. So this is really a time that we have to wage a struggle. I think Obama's on the right side on this stuff. If his proposal to raise the minimum wage had been passed by the Senate, Elizabeth Warren said it would have affected 14 million children would have had a better life. They wouldn't be rich, but they had a better life if that hadn't been passed. And right now, de Blasio wants to pass it. And I see the governor, under pressure to get the working families line, has agreed that he's going to throw his support to raising the minimum wage. So these are times we can win, and we can fight, and we can bring people together on all these things. And I think the violence in our community has to be seen in its economic root, and how every time we turn on television, there's some horrible thing happening, and they're pushing the idea that it's something inherent in our people that this would happen, that it's something genetic about us that we like violence. Not true. We're not the violent ones. The violent ones were done to us. We have been the victims of violence and terror and so forth. It is the fact that they have demobilized, unstabilized our community so that people don't feel they have hope and anywhere to go. That's what we have to fight on and build a movement that's going to do it. And I think the minimum wage fight is a big way to be able to do it, as well the fight for jobs. But cannot let these last meeting we had here, a young woman, Kenya, was there. She said she was coming tonight. She didn't make. She said the most important thing in the next thing, if you want to change it, the most important thing is to fight to change the Congress of the United States, so that when the fast food workers knock on the door for relief, when the immigrants knock on the door for some path to citizenship, when the homeless knock on the door, somebody's going to open that door and say, yeah, step on it, we're going to do something about it. We don't have a Congress like that now. That's what we have to fight to do it. And that means also not letting the Republicans gain entrance, and so on. So this is why we have been pushing this class. Angela sent a beautiful message when she was here, and we're going to plan now to have an additional class on what is Marxism, which is the underlining ideological and theoretical foundation for everything we have been discussing here tonight, and our analytical tool that has helped us see how this great sweep of history called the Civil Rights Movement of the 60s and so on has taken off. So Any questions? Okay.
I have a comment.
Okay.
I've done some reading, bits and pieces here and there, but listening to you and Danny tonight, pieces, brings it all together. And it's the reason why I and others will continue to work in the party and bring new people into the party. It's a wonderful, wonderful history, wonderful struggle, and a wonderful future. And the party is going to be a major force, I think a major force in bringing that better society around, bring it to the rest of the people in the U.S. That's my comment.
Good comment, Dan. Okay. Anybody else? Any more questions?
There's just one big question in my head. After listening to Danny, how do you stay calm and not be angry? That's all I'm thinking.
How do you say, I'm sorry?
How do you stay calm and not be angry?
How do you stay calm and not get angry?
I am so angry, you can't. No, I'm telling you, I am so angry when I see what they have done.
Okay.
But just like thinking of people in the South on the Jim Crow and how angry they were, and how hurt they were. But they understood when it came along and there was a movement that they had to participate in this movement. That's the only way they changed. If they would have gone like those workers from Detroit who wanted to go down and shoot people up, it would have been a bloodbath. The entire federal government would have sided with them, with the racists. I'm telling you. And they understood that. And Martin Luther King understood that. And that work, things they learned from the Highland School, understood that. And so the anger can't dictate your tactics.
Right.
It can make you fight hard, but it can't. Don't let it dictate your tactics. Your tactics have to be on a higher level of rational thinking and so on. And that's what we try to do, that higher level of rational thinking and so on. And I'm sure y'all do too.
I'd like to comment on that too. I'm angry too, but not in the same way, of course, as Jarvis and the direct victims. But I'm angry that the big business, and especially its right-wing sectors, have been able to fool so many white people for so many years to act against their own interests. Because that's really what it is. And I recall Richard Trumka, the head of the AFL-CIO, in the first campaign of Obama, deciding to go into areas where there were white workers, members of the AFL-CIO, that he was afraid might vote for the racists and for the right. And he made a speech, place after place, and sent lieutenants to do the same thing, to say that I'm aware that this community has traditionally been influenced by racism, but your self-interest, your interests in this election are to vote for an African-American president for the first time. And if you vote on the basis of racism, you're a goddamn fool. And he had an effect. Some 65% of all trade unionists and their families voted for Obama, much higher than the general population, even though the AFL-CIO was then about 60% white. The percentage of African American and Latino are increasing every year. But there is that understanding, and therefore to understand, the Communist Party has always taught that white communists have a special role to play in talking to other white working people and helping them to understand what's really in their interests and fighting racism. Not that we're going to be perfect. We're going to make mistakes. I learned from leading African American comrades sometimes in a big meeting where I was corrected when something I didn't understand was insensitive. You know, we're not perfect, but to understand a certain division of labor, and together the party plays a united role in being a foremost fighter for full equality and against all forms of racism. That's it.
Anybody else want to speak? I thought you had your hand up there for a minute. Can I read this, before I turn the floor over to Esteban, tell us about the next step. Can I read this poem by Maya Angelou, who I knew, and one of my best friends was one of her best friends, and I met her on many occasions. And the thing I remember most is when she looked down at my feet and she says, "What size shoe you wear?" And I said, "Size 13. She said, "That's the same size I wear." You know, she was a very tall woman. Anyway, Trump also said the phrase that if you vote for the Republicans against Obama and so forth, it's like a chicken voting for Colonel Sanders. So anyway, and you know, we're not stuck on anybody. All we're saying is, how do you move forward? You have to deal with the reality of where you're at now and how to move forward. And the great mass of people have found the vehicle. The only way you could defeat the right was to put Obama in there. But more than that, the whole symbolism of electing the first African-American president cannot, in this country, cannot be reduced. Even though we don't agree with some, especially foreign policy issues, the truth is that it was a big step forward. And the re-election was a big step forward for our country. Maya Angelou, I rise. You may shoot me with your words. You may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise up from a past that's rooted in pain. I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling. I bear in the tide, leaving behind nights of terror and fear. I rise into a daybreak that's wondrous and clear. I rise, bring the gifts that my ancestor gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. Great poem. Anyway.
Let's give it up one more time for the amazing presentation. So I just want to let everybody know we got the summer coming up, so I hope everybody got plans to enjoy their summer, maybe even take a little trip somewhere. But we're going to be heating it up in the streets here in New York City. As was referred to tonight, there's fast food workers and a whole class of low-wage workers here, from the car washes to bank workers that are organizing here. And our party is going to be on the front lines this summer, helping them in those various campaigns. But we're going to be having probably one day, so that this the People's School for Marxist Studies isn't going to be doing any series over the summertime, but we're going to be having one-day classes. So we'll be calling you and sending out emails to see when's convenient, and of course inviting you to that. But I'm actually up here right now because I want to announce that in either the first or the second week of September, we're going to be having our series on what is Marxism. We spoke about it at the last class. That's the plan for our next series. So we have a flyer that we've printed out, and we wanted to make sure to give it up to everyone here so you could be the first ones to sign up for this class and you could spread the word. We're very happy with this group. There's some new faces here tonight. There's some people who've been up with us from the beginning, but we really want to make a big push for when September comes around, that we really kind of get everyone on board, and you know, so on. And whoever's here over the summertime, we really want to invite you to work with us out in the streets and to come to whatever series we have. So I'm going to pass this around to everybody, but once again, I want to thank you for coming out. I want to encourage you to check out our website and continue the discussion on peoplesworld.org, our newspaper, and of course in the on the cpusa.org, which is our party's website. So thank you again for coming. Thank you online for tuning in, and have a good night.
Before we go, our friends from Ireland, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah.
I know you just got off the plane.
Well, I would just like to, I was just thinking there that the civil rights movement in Ireland, the Communist Party were very long active in that, even before the 60s and 50s, and there's research being done to show that. But Betsy Sinclair, who was a leading communist in the civil rights movement, Civil Rights Association, actually sang. She was the one that sang "We Shall Overcome," and of course, a lot of the inspiration for the civil rights movement in the north of Ireland came from this part of the world. So we were thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
I have a copy of Freedom Ways. This was launched